Children's Hour. I feel I should fill in some philosophy, or more formal advice. Channels can be changed. Here too. Let it be known that a man in a box is yet a man. A man buried is as lonely as he will ever be and ever was. Walls move if you do not watch them. Never take the pill. Highly regimented diets of air will sustain us. Troughs are to be watered and pigged upon. Mountains climbed are no less immortal. The back of the hand is a ravine that should not be crossed. Never touch. The unremarkable sound that faints in your bedroom at night is glass shattering. Swallow when spoken to, spit when exhumed. A tar-stained rope will never do. A year's worth of salt will build upon dank newspapers left quiet. Ignore the patterns in the smeared print. They only forebode. Eschewed and stern, default. Let the noises crowd each other like tea leaves, and turn to the stars. Diviners are to be held in faith. The most graceful motion is a slice. The most noble motion is a feint. Now he focuses. Stands up. Draws breath. Slowly exhales. He looks ahead, but not quite. He keeps his eyes from straining. He reminds himself not to look out too far. He's stronger. He's wiser. This is his moment. This is his time to shine, his spotlight. His moment in the spotlight. This is his moment. He stands. He stands and is ready to deliver. He's stronger. He calms himself, collects his thoughts, gathers his wits about him, is stronger. He collects his wits, gathers himself. Cool. He exhales. He draws his breath. He stands straight. His back is stronger. He backs himself away. He draws breath. He's cooler. He draws himself up. He strongs himself. He gathers his wits. It's time to shine back. Spotlight. Time to shine spotlight. Time to gather his wits and back himself strongly. Back to his spotlight in the back of it strongly. Gather his breath back and strongly back himself to the breath of it. Breath it. Breathe it strongly and wit gather himself strong it. Cool it strongly, making force of it. He is stronger. He is wiser. He is gathering himself. About to strongly. He is about to deliver. A sick wind rises up. It is unhealthy. It isn't cared for. It is a wind that has been left without other less frightening winds. A wind that has no way of its own length and reach and height above all. A wind, young, that derives its power from forward movement. Leaving behind all it can, including the knowing that it will, full well, come back in circular ways to where it began and was born. A wind without ease. Unease. A diseased wind. It knows it can only circle before a gradual disappearing or dissipating or placating sadness. And so the wind cries, not in song but in motion. The wind is crying when it runs through the cities that touch a certain height, cities with buildings large enough to call. And it cries when it knows there is an answer behind it. It moves. It always moves. The wind, though lonely and sick, can take itself around the world or around itself in an equally as circuitous and impressed feat. In less time than it takes for the men the wind winds around to realize they've been left behind by something that moves forward much faster and much better than them. The wind is not pride. The wind is sick. There is not a cure for the wind. There isn't a cure. There is no diagnosis. The wind can only allocate itself to itself, can only cry because it knows the very motion it uses, forward, not back. Back would only be forward when trapped like the wind is trapped. So the wind can only move its sadness into a furtherance of itself. The wind is immortal. The wind is cherished, though. By the men and the women it wraps around when the weather's right. By the calls above the buildings, they're known. By the ones who bear it. By the parts of itself it does not know, but knows it does not know. By the same parts that do not know they do not know, they only know, like the wind, that movement. It is a forward-wrapping circle. The wind cries. The circle does not change as it's forward. And the wind, who is born sad and cries to move, does not think about its height or furtherance. The wind sees the wind ahead of itself. The wind an impression of the next wraparound. The wind, because it was born a very long space ago, knows its links only in regard to the changes and faces that the men and women make with it. The wind also knows that, as it must be bound by stream of itself, a space unlike the wind because it is not part of the wind. It is a part of itself, and a part of itself, and a part of itself again, until there are no parts but only the spaces between. The wind cannot move alongside itself like the men and women can, because the men and women are all the same. Their faces. They move alongside one another and have that union or that left-behind sadness that the wind cannot fantasize about or dream about but knows is there, feels in itself, but only in motion. Another, not another, as the wind cannot know another or two or one more piece. Please, the wind must run by its own strength of forward motion. It can move. It will move. The wind is a will. It does not know this, as it must be still to know, but it does feel. The wind feels this. This is the secret of the crying and the sadness and the diseased circuit. The wind does a sensing. It senses without itself knowing, like numb parts of the men who run alongside each other or the women who smile when wrapped around. The faces do not know each other, but the wind senses. But the wind also, while moving, feels in it that if it stopped, the sense of itself, the wind knowing that in its motion it is a motive and sensing thing, it knows it can stop. To stop and be still is not to be wind but space, filled or not, air. Wind, though born, feels unknown to death, feels itself to be known only in moving, sometimes achieving the same place in two circles, sometimes wrapping around the same faces, all the same, sometimes in fear of its birth, or fear of its sadness, or fear of its ceaseless motive motion, or fear of its sensing, knowing, fear of its not being wind, fear. The wind is fear. The wind is fear in knowing. And the people who run alongside each other can only block their eyes, shiver.
Coming to you from LARB HQ in Silver Lake, Los Angeles, California. This is the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down today with Ken Baumann, author of the new novel you have just heard passages from, Solip. He does a lot of literary things. He co-runs a press with Blake Butler called Sator, and he has written essays for a number of venues. I want to talk about some of those as well. Sure. He's an actor. What should we underscore as well that LARB readers really should know that you are involved in, literarily speaking?
That's an excellent question. I feel like that was a damn good summary. That was a Chaucer-esque herald. Well, I publish a literary journal with Blake Butler, too, called No Colony. Sator Press is actually, I publish No Colony through Sator Press, but I'm the sole editor and sort of dude in a garage of Sator Press, although Blake has always been a close friend and just a general helper. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I have a book coming out in fall called Say Cut Map, which is a novel from Blue Square Press. And then I'm right now working on a book about a classic video game called Earthbound. So that's I'm on a deadline now for the first time in my life, a paid deadline with people waiting to read the finished product, which is interesting.
Now, Solip was not, I guess, on a deadline.
No.
And it's also, furthermore, something I've heard called a non-novel.
Sure.
What is that?
That's a good question. That's a good question for my publisher and his copyist. I don't know. I've always felt that it was a novel to me in the same way that books like The Passion According to G.H. by Clarice Lispector or How It Is by Samuel Beckett. Those feel like a novel. The idea of the novel is so amorphous now that it can almost accommodate anything, which it kind of makes the argument, well, why even, tag that on the book? But I think that a novel sort of gives a little wink to potential readers that this is something that at least the author feels is cohesive. That even if it's a little nutty or weird or obtruse or even sort of aggressive, like How It Is or The Passion According to G.H., that the reader knows that the writer had a certain faith when working on it, that it will cohere into something, a sort of system. And
it gives you a trust, or encourages you to trust the author.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope that's the case. And so I feel like I just sort of tagged it on. maybe I also felt that it was necessary to tag it on because I knew from the start that what I wanted the book to look like, and I designed it, and I thought, this is going to look like a pretty enigmatic little inscrutable thing. And so maybe if someone could find something, be it in the copy or on the title page, that it was indeed a novel, that would help again instill a little bit of trust, or at least guide some curiosity, provide someone a framework to approach it with.
Because when it's your first book out, they don't have much to go on, do they? So you're just jumping off the cliff in a sense.
Oh, absolutely. And I feel like, although I don't know, I feel like I'm jumping off the cliff with everything, to be honest.
That's the only way to do it.
I guess, yeah. I mean, jump off feet first and hope you don't hit the rocks. But yeah, I mean, that's I think about it for my literary stuff.
Reading this book, I sensed two strategies that were viable. Number one, read it very, very fast. Number two, read it very, very slowly. Have you encountered books in your life that you've thought those are the ways to go about them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a way, I feel like every book that I really respond to, that happens. In that I want to stay up all night and just blow through it, and then immediately afterwards, I'm compelled to return to it. I mean, ultimately, I think with art, in general, attention is the only metric; it's the only guiding light. So, hopefully, if you felt that inclination, I hope other readers feel that, because that's a better. It's better to have two strategies than one, as an invitation to just draw more of the reader's attention and study.
And book design geeks will have that pathway in as well. I mean, I read the advanced reader's copy, which you've told me, don't judge the book by this. What should a reader who's buying a real copy expect to experience on a pure design level?
Sure. I mean, the first thing I look at when I wake up are books, and the last thing I look at when I go to bed is books. And
you sleep here in the LARB office, that's why.
I do. I sleep, in this very room.
It's under this table. We have a cot.
There's a little mat. It's just, it's very traditional and Japanese. I curl up like a cat. But I like paper a lot, and I'm really tactile with books. And so I always knew sort of what the cover stock should look like. And I want readers, when they see the book in person, or when they, rip open the Amazon box or buy it from, their local independent bookstore, go independent bookstores, that they feel that it... I think maybe my sort of design guidance is best stated by the book's epigraph. It's a quote from Gustav Mahler. "The call of love sounds very hollow among these immobile rocks." And to me, that informed my sense of what I wanted the book to feel like to a stranger, because I want it to feel sort of earthy in a way, if that makes sense, sort of like atomic. So in other words, simple, black, small, tactile, not like glossy or not reflective in any way, fragile, and like a little bit of a mystery. So hopefully I accomplish those things with the weird cover image and just the lack of all information on the actual book, which is a little obnoxious, I'm sure, to my publisher, but he actually was like, you do whatever you want design-wise. And I went, are you sure you want to give me permission, Gian, to do whatever I want? People often regret saying that. But
no takebacks.
Yeah, no takebacks. But he supported it, and I was like, okay, great. But I think the non-novel thing is that's certainly something that he whipped up in his copy factory. And I'm fine. I told him, you sell the book however you want. And you're a madman for wanting to sell this book, because it's not an easy thing to kind of market. But I'm happy with how he's done it.
We talked a little bit about how a book has to inspire trust in the reader, but it seems like there's a sense, at least with Solip, that you trust the reader to either pay attention or not pay attention, and it's all good, I guess. Does that ring a bell with you? Absolutely.
It's sort of a chicken and the egg thing. I don't know if my thoughts about that kind of attitude come from my time with the voice of that book, or if you know what I mean? I don't know which came first or what informed what. But I am constantly... I think it's important now, when our attention in this country or in any like highly industrialized place is so beset with calls for it and demands on it and
Be the first to like this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's shit constantly in your purview that you did not ask for and nobody you knew asked for, but it's still there. And so I feel like this voice might embrace the idea that attention is both sacred and highly useless, and that you know, and just totally profane. It's that to me was the tension of the book that I felt when writing it, and I feel when reading it, and when I was editing it, is this oscillation between the sacred and the profane, the silent and the performative, and you know, having faith in something and damning it, and wanting to be paid attention to and wanting to be ignored. All these tensions. So hopefully that, I'm glad that you picked up on that. That's a good sign to me, and I hope other readers do pick up on that. That, I mean, really, from a personal perspective, if someone buys my book and wants to throw it in the garbage, I encourage them to, or use it for kindling. I mean, I really don't. I won't be hurt by that at all. In fact, it'll probably give me a little smile if someone was like, "I hated your book and I lit it on fire." Like, that's phenomenal. That's a great
reaction. That's something.
I want intensity of response as opposed to just so yeah. Maybe that voice has something to do with my personal outlook, or maybe my personal outlook arose from trying to cope with what this voice did in my head when it was kind of working its way through. I don't know, but that's great that you picked up on that.
So, do you do a lot of reading of books with voices that, shall we say, carry you along, or sort of go without you in a sense? I mean, you mentioned Clarice Lispector. That's, I would say her books tend to do that. Or like a David Markson or Mark Lane, or these books where they just keep plowing forward, and you can hang with them, or you can drop in and out. It all works as an experience. You don't. A certain traditional novels, if you don't pay attention for a chapter, you're not going to like the next chapter because it won't make any sense. But there's a different sense of sense here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, maybe that's like the poetic sense or something. That it's weird because I think also this novel, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to speak too much to what the voice is reacting against, because I don't know, and I don't know if I'll ever know. But I know that me personally, there's a lot of tension in me about being bored with monomythical narrative. Maybe that has something to do with the fact that I've been working in the entertainment industry in Hollywood for so long. You know what I mean? You get tired of that shit.
Since your early teens, right?
Yeah, I've been working professionally since I was 11. And so it's really all I've known. There's such a reliance, and there's such a cult of the monomythical Joseph Campbell, Christopher Vogler story structure in Hollywood, that you gotta worship at the altar of story, and then that'll unlock that's it. As long as you follow this certain pattern, you unlock certain, intractable, responses in any reader. It's universal and blah, blah, blah. But I think that's bullshit for the most part.
Is it just appealing because it's pitched as, here's the solution, here's the answer, you can have it, and that's in Hollywood that kind of plays?
Absolutely. I mean, I do think that there are obviously, Campbell's a brilliant guy, there are obviously fundamental patterns to world religions and beliefs and archaic society and of, more modern religion, and our brains are causal machines, and the way we create and construct cause is pretty similar. That's not that varied. So maybe it both frustrates me that monomythical story, does work so well. Maybe I think that is a frustration to me too, that it's not just that people preach it, but that it's also that it is so effective. And I've found myself moving at a certain point away from that kind of storytelling or that kind of literature and into this other realm of a sense that, yeah, it's maybe more of a poetic sense that the narrative is not necessarily paint by numbers, but it still affected me in a really weird way, in a way that felt almost more intense, because instead of a journey that it inscribed in my head, it inscribed an atmosphere, and there's something to be said for a really deep fog that you got to drive through. You know what I mean? I mean, a night drive is pleasurable, but there's something uniquely terrifying about driving through a really deep fog. And I feel like maybe those books provided that fog for me.
It brings to mind an essay I read from you about formative art experiences, the central one being 2001, right? Kubrick's 2001, which itself does that, doesn't it?
I think so. I mean, in 2001 to me is sort of like Wittgenstein's Tractatus, because they both begin as attempts to service that native story and its structure. And then, near the end, they just go totally mystical and batshit crazy. And I to me that is so beautiful and honest and so aligned to the. I mean, it sounds it's pretty morbid, but it sounds so aligned to death to me as well. I mean, no matter how much self-narration you do when you're living on your deathbed, it's often more equivalent to psychedelia than it is to, I've done it. I've pulled the sword from the stone for the most part. And
think of where Dave Baumann ends up at the end of the movie.
Exactly. And so to me, as a kid, that was so much more mysterious and compelling. And that's the thing too that's nice about monomythical story is it provides you with enough thrill that you want to return to it. And the good ones do have enough mystery to also make you return to it. But I kind of favor the stories that really front load the mystery or near the end just inject a huge portion of it that casts the entire tale in a new light. That to me is more compelling and more enigmatic. And maybe I'm just the kind of person who's more curious, just for some fateful genetic reason, for that kind of mystery, that sort of aesthetic mystery, because not all people need it to be happy. I mean, not all people need literature at all to be happy. It's totally an elective thing, but for some reason, I find myself drawn to those narratives, and I feel like my entire life my entire literary life is going to be guided by pushing against that or accepting it.
You mentioned your acting life began professionally at about 11. Did you put pen to paper at all in a creative way before that? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is which came first?
Yeah. Writing and books came first. I had always been like an ostentatious little bastard. And I was always the kid who, when allowed to like make a little book or story in class, I'd go nuts and really embrace that. And I was always a huge reader as a kid. I grew up in a town where football and church were the things. And I didn't go to church because my parents weren't religious. I wasn't raised with religion. And I was like a tiny little kid, tiny, weak little kid. So football wasn't my thing either. And, I still managed to kind of like skate between social groups and feel comfortable. Like I was a pretty happy kid. I wasn't picked on. But I just read a lot. And so books were my first love by far. I certainly have had, incredibly formative experiences with movies and even TV. But books were the thing that I came to first. And that I started making first. I mean, when I was, God, I don't know how old, but I remember just trying to cop like all the stuff from all the fantasy novels I was reading when I was like in 5th grade or 4th grade. And I was like, I'm going to write a fantasy novel. And I did, quote unquote. I wrote a novel, meaning, it was probably like 8,000 words, but I was like, yeah, that's a novel. But
I have a sense of scale as a kid.
Yeah, no scale whatsoever. I was like, hey, I've got a map. I've got the fantasy map. I've got the mythology and the language.
Look at this cover.
Yeah, it's incredible. Exactly. Look at the cover. It's got a dragon on it. But it was Harry Potter. It was little kid, And maybe this is another testament to monomythical story.
This was post Harry Potter, right?
Pre-Harry Potter.
Okay. I'm getting the timeline down here.
No, but that was it. I wrote a story about a kid who goes to a wizardry school and his parents are killed by an evil wizard and blah, blah, blah. So, and I don't think anybody would claim that Harry Potter is an original story. It's not a novel story, but it's really well executed. It's told with great panache and imagination and emotion and all that. But I remember when Harry Potter came out being so pissed. I was like, this woman stole my work. But yeah, so that's always been the thing. I came to performance later, and I loved it, and I still do. But books were always the thing that was deepest and earliest for me.
So it sounds like you did your growing up essentially in the world of Friday Night Lights. I've never seen that show, but it sounds like that's the setting. And you're now acting is your main job. Is there some pressure? Just these two very worlds, do they somehow indirectly exert pressure on you to go to the opposite of them, whether it's in literature or like to do a yin yang thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Which I feel like sometimes is great and sometimes is pretty frustrating. I mean, I think, like most people, I sometimes crave just like some crazy totalitarian authority in my head to go like, you do this now, for your life. I want somebody to come down and be like, this is it. You just dedicate yourself to that and you don't ask questions.
It takes a lot of pressure to decide away. I
know. Yeah, exactly. And, that's the whole thing, like driving us to tyranny and all that. We just want somebody to decide for us. But, I feel like I've made that little bounce or oscillation work in the past, and I try to keep it going. Lately, I felt more pushed towards the book stuff, but that's also just what I've been doing more, right. and sort of with increasing access and I'm getting paid a little bit now to do it, and just all these little sort of markers that are fun, novel, like signifiers that like, oh, people are maybe enjoying what you're doing. But yeah, it's been an interesting thing to have both be so present, and for the most part the acting has paid for all the literature times a billion, so I don't think that if I wanted to like make a career of it that the writing is there yet for me, but yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. That has definitely been a guiding principle. My life's bouncing back and forth.
To set up a little bit for listeners where you're coming from, I mean, when you get stopped in Trader Joe's or whatever, and someone's just sort of giving you that like double take, what is it they say they saw you in?
Secret Life of the American Teenager, by far.
That's a television show.
Yeah, that was a television show that ran for 5 years. It just wrapped up not long ago, and it was at one point, it was like 4.5 million people were watching the show, and to me that was just like staggering. That's a staggering amount of people.
And your character was who?
His name was Ben Boykewich. Was, because he's dead now in the realm of all TV, canceled.
Did they kill him off, or did they? Okay.
I wish they had killed him off. That would have been great to go out in like a blaze of gunfire. But yeah, that's for the most part people recognize me. I get a few other things, but that was predominantly it. And I was on that show full time for 5 years and managed to do a few things here and there outside of it. But, it was a big job and it required a lot of work. And like I said, it had quite a bit of popularity, which it's an odd thing. I mean, I never thought that pursuing acting would lead to that situation of being in public, being recognized. And it sounds naive, but it's never something that I thought was even possible. I never
Maybe
thought
it happens for other people, but I'm different.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, no, it's just, whatever. And it's totally naive, for me to have thought that. And it's not, it's an odd situation because it's structurally kind of weird, because the situation itself in theory, I don't like, but the people I always enjoy, and I just enjoy people in general. And so it's never that it's happening that it kind of makes me uncomfortable, but it's just that it exists as a phenomenon, that this sort of thing where people can lose their anonymity. And
just that people are staring at each other in Trader Joe's.
Sure, yeah, exactly. Like, hey, eyes down, buy your bok choy and get out of here.
Yes, that's the totalitarian.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. I'm a fascist. But so that's weird to me. And like I said, it's okay. And but I didn't know how much I valued my anonymity until I didn't have it. And I think that's just a human thing. You don't know what you got until it's gone.
Well, there's a sense in which it's also different if somebody is at a reading and talks to you like, hey, I really enjoy your writing, and here's what it made me think about. You think, great, that's something I did that they engaged with. It was something you did.
Yeah.
When they say, I saw you on a show, it's like, are they responding to the show someone else wrote? Are they responding to the character someone else wrote for me? Or, maybe they are responding to the way you played the character. Great, but there's so many things they could be reacting to.
You're right. And I feel like you sort of you get an intuitive sense of what they may be responding to when they first come up to you. I mean, and unfortunately...
Expect you to be the guy, the character?
Yeah. And unfortunately, that's it. And it's okay. I mean, I think it's an innocent enough thing to see someone in public and call them by their character name and keep calling them by their character name, and even
probably young kids too, right?
It's young kids, it's teenagers, it's young kids, not all young kids. I mean, I've had older gentlemen and like a 70-year-old woman, and like who the show was just sort of like, oh, I guess it's TV. Right. A very diverse group of people watched it, but
people just leave the TV on. There's the difference. People leave the TV on. The show might come on. They just happen to catch it. Won't happen with Solip. I don't think they seek it out. They seek it out and they deliberately read it, which is good, but harder.
Exactly. But there's something about that thing of when you see another human in person that you have seen in your living room week to week.
Our tribal brains think you're related to them somehow.
Exactly. And that's exactly it. And like I said, I think it's innocent, but I also think it's indicative of something that's a little sinister. But sinister in a way that just like modern life is a little sinister. And modern life is super sinister, by the way. It's not a little. I mean, modern life is too complex and the system is unfair and cruel and faulty and fat-tailed and all the bad stuff. But it's a sensation that I've never gotten used to, and I like I said, I always like the people. The people are generally wonderful, but the sensation itself is something that always kind of makes me a little uncomfortable, and not like I said, not prohibitively, but just a little. It always kind of clicks in my head, like, oh, this is weird.
Now you tweet out to like 30,000 people who follow you, and do you have a sense of the breakdown there? How many people are following your character, or they just think, hey, that guy I've seen on TV? How many are following your writing? I would imagine it's like a half breakdown. I mean, I pulled that out of the air. Mm-hmm. But my question is more about when you're being a public persona on Twitter, you're writing about your writing. You're writing about you're writing about, as you've just said, the diagnosis of what may be happening in the world. You're writing about a lot of things. Are you at all trying to bridge the people who come at you from different directions, come to you?
Yes. And exactly as you said, I always feel when I get into these little didactic moods that I'm just like an asshole on Twitter that's like, yeah, the world works like this. And
do you lose like 1,000 followers whenever you do that?
I wish. That'd be kind of cool. If I could actually have that sort of like definitive response, that'd be great. But, I haven't studied it too closely, but I do think that it's about 95, if not more, % people who have come to me through Secret Life of the American Teenager, and about 5% through my writing.
So I was a little bit off.
But hey, I think that's it's just I underestimate sometimes that how popular the show was. But then anytime I look and just look at just sort of on my little at section,
what's your at replies like? What's the stream look like?
It's mostly Secret Life of the American Teenager stuff. It's mostly teenage girls
about a show that's over.
Yeah, about a show that's over, but it's also internationally not over. So that's that
Brazilians
William
and such
thing. Like the futures here, it's just not evenly distributed. So
the Japanese saw the end of your show before you shot the end,
before we even started filming it. It was incredible.
Long past, they've come around the other side. It's retro now.
But yeah, but it's still predominantly American teenagers that are just thinking like, oh, it's cool to like talk to this dude on Twitter, but sometimes. And this is the thing I live for. You'll get the teenage or young girl who reads some of my writing and is moved by it, or sends me an email and says, I ordered a book through Sator Press or blah. So in other words, when
you see someone make the jump,
when I see someone make the jump, it really is heartening to me, and I think that. I'm kind of obnoxious because with a platform like this, even though Twitter metrics are kind of skewed and that the people who actually read most of your tweets, such a small %, I mean, I think it's like less than 10% of people actually follow in a strict sense other people on Twitter.
And who reads every tweet from Ashton Kutcher, ultimately?
Exactly. So I know people miss stuff, and that's fine. I mean, that's built into the medium, but or the platform, rather. But there is an excuse or like a little opportunity for me to be didactic, which I kind of hate, but at the same time, I feel like, man, I wish I had heard that shit when I was, 17 or 16 or 15.
You want to go back 5-10 years to yourself and say, okay, myself following me on Twitter.
Yes.
Listen up.
Absolutely. And just like shake. And it's unfortunate because I totally cater to my preferences of being super into literature and the arts and, blah, blah, blah. But I've also, I try to read enough dissent or encounter enough dissent in my life about what I think is important. And sometimes, I'm able to present both sides of a topic or something. Like recently, Joy Williams wrote this article called The Case Against Babies about overpopulation, ostensibly, and energy consumption. And I absolutely believe that humanity's ecological capacities are kind of fucked, and that there are too many people, but more importantly, there are too many people who consume just like hyper consume. Americans, we're the worst. I'm the worst. I'm part of the problem. But I feel like when I was a kid, most of my friends, girls and boys, thought that you grow up, you get married, you go to church, you have babies, and you get a nice, safe job, and you die, and that's good.
So that's where that's going on.
Yeah,
Texas.
Exactly. Yeah, it's going on in Abilene, Texas. And they're not wrong. But I thought, okay, if I can just tweet this article, if anybody is curious enough to read, that's a huge thing. Somebody to just jump in and start reading now, because reading the, poo-poo for most people. Like, people just don't do it that often. Especially young people, which is, again, fine. But if I could get one or two 15-year-old girls who suddenly start thinking like, wait, maybe I don't have to like have kids to be happy. That's great. That's the thing. But so many of my, I do want kids. I so many of my friends are having kids now, and it's not something that I think is inherently unethical. I think that raising a kid well is such an art and so important. But again, I want to use the platform to try to present outs and options to people that might not have encountered them. So in other words, I could just talk about, I'm going to Disneyland today with my celebrity friends. I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm eating this, I'm at a party and blah, blah, blah. But that's all bullshit. That's all bullshit that doesn't provide any actionable information to these kids beyond consume, look for fame, watch TV, etc. So anything I can do to be like, well, there are other ways, there are other options. You have options. Look for the options. That's the goal.
And if you have the 15-year-old girls on your side, you kind of, the rest of the world falls in line ultimately. I mean, they're the wave of the future, right?
I guess so. I mean, using, this is a terrible metric anymore, but using the box office, like it used to be just like, well, market just to teen boys, right. But now increasingly it's teen girls too. And it is kind of funny. I don't think of the people who follow me on Twitter as any sort of like followers in the sense of the word that like they're gonna give a shit about me in a month, let alone like years. But yeah, so I in other words, I'm just like using the platform beyond pure self-promotion, which I do, enough to make me chastise myself for doing it. But beyond that, I want to go like, well, maybe think about what kind of messages you didn't have the sort of like the luxury of receiving as a kid. You had to seek them out. So if someone could have presented that to you earlier, how maybe it would have been beneficial. And that drives me to, like I said, get in my little ranty spouts that are a little obnoxious, but hopefully for the good. I don't know.
Speaking of consumption, I remember a Vice essay you wrote on a Los Angeles-y subject called what was the title? How Jonathan Gold Gave Me Crohn's Disease.
Jonathan Gold gave me
yes,
Crohn's
and what's
purely accusative.
what's the probability that in fact eating what he recommended contributed to that?
Empirically, I have no idea, but my hunch is that there's a high probability.
Well,
because
what kind of thing did you eat on Jonathan Gold's recommendation?
The question is, what didn't I eat? I mean, it was bad. I was, like I said, I was working on this show. I was getting paid too much money, and I had too much free time. And for my health, by the way, for anybody's health, that salary that I had was poison. I really do think
it might as well have been a trust fund at that point.
Exactly. I mean, not that level. Thank God, not that level.
It wasn't a really like less than zero situation, but you could see how they develop.
Totally. And that's the thing. It's that Daniel Kahneman behavioral psychology thing. $75,000 a year. Right. Well, God, although with inflation, that's getting pile drived. But $75,000 a year is like the level where your emotional happiness does not increase when you make more money. Your satisfaction can, but not your emotional happiness. So I was making more than that, unfortunately, for my health's sake. And the whole time, I didn't spend money irresponsibly, and I still don't. I was lucky. I got parents that drilled that into me as a kid. But I was irresponsible in one big way, and that was I'm a glutton. And I encountered this list, and I was like, well, I'm going to eat at all these restaurants. That was my quest in a year. And it's 99 restaurants. I had only already eaten at about 10 of them. And so I started. And because I'm a glutton and I was bored and my hours were pretty good on set, I would have nights free. And so I would take my wife and my fiance at the time, I would take her and we'd go out to dinner. I thought, this is good. Like, we'll get a taste of LA's culinary scene.
Right.
And
that is really a way to experience the city too, legitimately, is if you're not eating the food here in as much of a variety as possible, you're not really experiencing Los Angeles.
I totally agree. And so we started. And I probably would have been okay if I wasn't such a fat boy inside and such a glutton. Because, like, I would go and I'd have Gold's review of the restaurant on my phone, and when we sat down to order, I'd sort of look at all the dishes he recommended. I'd order all those, and then sometimes I'd order more.
Right.
And
Gotta be safe.
Yeah, exactly. Got better safe than sorry, right? And I think I absolutely activated my Crohn's disease in a really severe way. I was eating so much food. First of all, binge eating, not good for Crohn's, for the obvious reasons. And fatty foods. That's sort of a debatable question about whether it's good for Crohn's or not. For the most part, symptomatically, not too much saturated fat. But of course, you eat at restaurants in LA, you're eating a lot of saturated fat, salt, and butter. And
you don't want to see the ingredient list.
No, God, no. That's that enforced ignorance is part of the beauty about restaurants. But so I was just eating. I was eating like crazy, and it really, in fact, that's probably my wife saying, calling, are you eating like crazy?
She knew we were bringing up the subject.
Yeah, exactly. But it totally, I feel like, activated my Crohn's disease and in a bad way. And I flared up real fast, real hard, and started feeling symptoms. 2 months later, I was in the hospital. So I don't think Jonathan Gold had any response. And, in the essay, I go on to say it's not Jonathan Gold's fault. But
beloved figure here. You don't want to make the wrong enemy.
I know. And that's in the end of the essay. I'm like, we're going to go out to a meal. And I hope I can go out to a meal with the guy. It's not his fault.
We're going to go to Animal. See ya.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. Like, oh, God, no. We'll eat some white bread and some brown rice and some bananas and call it a day.
We're going to the macrobiotic Japanese place on La Brea.
Yeah.
Every night from now on.
Yeah, every night. Every single night. But so it wasn't him, but it certainly was my hubris. And that's why I sort of liken it to, like, I was Samson. I flew close to the damn sun, the culinary sun. I got burned, man. But I'll never make that. Well, hopefully, knock on wood, I'll never make that mistake again.
we have to be stimulated by something. We're going to fill the void with something. And if it's following Jonathan Gold's edicts for all top 100 restaurants, if it's going as far out to the experimental edge in literature as possible. I mean, I'm not trying to draw too clear a line between these things, but
oh, you can.
You can. What am I even thinking is possibly my question here? It's that your environment is going to dictate what you might binge on, right? I mean, I imagine you saw back in Texas, you described friends thinking, they were indulging in football or or having big families. I don't know. I mean, it's keeping yourself in a variety of environments that limits what you binge on, that somehow controls the binging. Does it? I don't know. What's the strategy?
Absolutely. And I think you're dead on. I mean, sometimes I think like, yeah, I'm a good old, Nico McKeon moderate, I just kind of stay right in the middle. And that's so not true. Emotionally, I'm pretty good now. I mean, I think I'm just sort of chemically gifted by fate with just sort of a good broad level of happiness. And I don't have dips into chemical depression at all. And I'm pretty stoic by training. And just even keel. But that said, I'm learning more from exactly that kind of parallel that I do like, not extremes, but I get pretty intensely into stuff. And that was the first taste for me that you can't get too intensely into something because you're mortal and it can indeed kill you. Right. And literature, you can engage with it pretty intensely. It won't kill you, but it can damage your ability to interact with other human beings. I mean, that's, I think everybody knows that you get too scholarly, too monastic, you lose your just sort of common touch. And, and I don't want to let myself get there. Right. I don't think I will, especially now that I'm married to a incredible human that keeps me in check and make sure that I don't go down those roads of sort of excess. And I know that just very physically, like excess equals hospital equals surgery equals, but yeah, that's an interesting thing that I'm learning more, but very recently I'm learning that's the case.
I recall in childhood my own vice was video games, and you mentioned, like, we were both in our 20s, or early and late 20s respectively, but someone our age in America, it's hard not to grow up playing a lot of video games. When we did the 90s and such, were a pretty good time for gaming. And you're writing a book on Earthbound, a Japanese role-playing game on the Super Nintendo that a lot of people loved. In Japan and here, there's sequels in Japan and such. Here it was just the one, and it had scratch and sniff stickers, as I recall. And I mean, it was a little before your time, wasn't it, Earthbound?
It kind of was, although that's great that your vice was video games. I'm tempted to just like talk, about video games. Ask you all about your what did you have one video game that you remember, like the one for you?
I'm 28, so I grew up in the heart of the Genesis versus Super Nintendo debate. I was a Genesis kid, so I sort of couldn't play Earthbound legally in a sense, or at least the playground wouldn't permit me until I grew up a bit and could be on both sides. I could cross Jerusalem there in some sense, but I was very much a Genesis player, and it was just all about playing as many games as possible and as frequently as possible.
Gotcha. Yeah, I feel that, man, and I still do that to this day. I'll get a game and again, it's that extreme thing. Well, and I'm getting better, but like, I'll play it 8 hours, and it's like, I'll play it all night. Right. But that was a masterful segue, by the way. I gotta give it to you into the Earthbound book. The Earthbound book has been fun so far. Earthbound itself is kind of peculiar. I first played it when I was 5. My older brother was 12. And although I had only played it once, maybe I had played it, twice or 3 times in when I was 5 and 6. Again, it's all kind of blurs. I don't really have like much documentation about any of this stuff, which is kind of part of the fun of the book. I'm like playing archaeologist with myself, but it stuck with me. It stuck with me so definitively. And I've always thought that the game was just totally fascinating. And so when Gabe Durham, the guy who is the publisher and editor-in-chief for Boss Fight Books, when he told me, hey, a pop culture series of books about video games doesn't exist, like 33 and a third.
Right.
And, and I said, like, yeah, it does. And I Googled it and it doesn't. Which is, that's like, there's something to be said about epistemology now in Google. It's like, it's not even a question of like, I didn't even think, wow, I'm going to have to do any work whatsoever to find out that answer. It's just like a little typing and I'll know. Google, the universe will provide the answer. Right. But we couldn't find anything from our cursory search. And so I got obsessed with the idea. And I was like, Gabe, you got to do this. You got to strike while the iron's hot. I guarantee you other people have this idea. It's the first one that into the market will win. And so I drove him a little crazy. Finally was like, if you write a book for it, I'll do it. I said, I'll do it. And I talked about Earthbound, Chrono Trigger, and Final Fantasy III.
Super Nintendo role-playing games, all of Japanese origin.
Correct. And I pretty immediately was like, it's got to be Earthbound. It's by far the most idiosyncratic game. It's so weird. And so then, pretty quickly we did the Kickstarter for the Boss Fight Books thing, and people responded, and suddenly I was like, okay, I have to write this book now. So I had only played it when I was young, and I'm replaying it now as an adult for the first time. Although I've known the culture of Earthbound pretty well for a while. Although now writing this book, I'm discovering that the culture is massive. I mean,
and it thrives today?
Yes. There are a few online communities, the biggest being starmen.net, that the people are just obsessed with this game. And
specifically that game, or is it about like the fan translations of the sequels? Is it about like hand localizing the other Earthbound, Mother, I guess the series is called in Japan, taking that stuff and bringing it here? What's it about? What are they doing?
I think that has a lot to do with it. But for the most part, my sense of it now, because Mother 3 is the English translation's done. It exists. And you can, play it on a legal ROM or whatever with this kind of homemade English translation. And because you can play Mother, Earthbound's prequel, on a ROM with an English translation, the work is sort of done. It's an interesting community in that there is no more work to be done. It's everything now is just pure aesthetic appreciation, admiration, super minute, obsessive, like detailing of aspects of the game or technicalities or its structure or its origin story, its origin rather. And so now most of what the Starman and Earthbound communities do are just keep up with Earthbound news in culture and just like make, pay-ons to the game. They're making fan art. They're making fan music. They're, writing about their experiences, replaying it for the 50th time.
It's Earthbound worship, essentially.
Totally.
But tell me, how many of the questions that drive your book are about what exactly makes Earthbound so compelling? What does that game tap into that people still appreciate? Is it all our age, roughly, people, or is it all types? Who is it, and what do you think they're responding to?
Who is it is a good question that I'm finding out more and more. I do think that there's, that sort of brunt of people who are between 5 and 15 when Earthbound came out in 95. I feel like that's the majority of the audience and the fan community. But now, my God, this is huge news for Earthbound fans. It just came out 2 or 3 days ago. Maybe 3 days ago on Wii U's store. So now if you have a Wii U, you can play Earthbound for the first time. So there's going to be a new generation of people who encounter this game, which is so exciting to me. And great, I feel like, just timing for the book because, hopefully it'll serve as just sort of like a little, a very hearty recommendation. But the people's fascination with it is something that I'm totally trying to pinpoint in the book. I do think that the book, I think it's the tone more than anything.
The tone of the game, which is funnier than most role-playing games.
Totally.
It's like modern day. It's kids Kid in a neighborhood with aliens. Come on, scratch and sniff cards.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, their marketing campaign was insane. It was
and
like,
unsuccessful, as I recall.
Yeah, and totally unsuccessful. The tagline was "This game stinks," and whoever came up with that was a genius. But no, they released scratch and sniff stickers with the game. The game, it failed because it was expensive and because the box was weird. The box was big. It came with a guide. It was $70 in 1995, which is equivalent to like $120 now. That's crazy expensive for a video game, so not many people bought it, and it bombed for all intents and purposes in America. But the tone is exactly that. It's contemporary. It was one of the first RPGs to be set now. And exactly, kids in a neighborhood with aliens. It's a common trope. It's the ET thing, but it was executed so beautifully, and it's not just kids in a neighborhood with aliens, and that's to me what makes the tone of Earthbound and what makes it so idiosyncratic, because the story is simple enough and cute and functional in a video game way, but it is the emotional aspects of the story that are super tuned up and like totally don't belong in a video game. It's sort of the moral lessons that are present and that most games just don't have at all, don't even attempt to have. And it is the crazy amount of inspiration from disparate pieces of culture. I mean, it's like playing the game is like encountering a Roger Corman B-sci-fi movie. It's like encountering the work of the Coen brothers. It's like encountering Norman Rockwell paintings and satire about American culture and consumption. It's encountering like myths about the origin of humanity. It's all of this stuff, and for some reason it just is the tone, the sort of self-satirical light tone that's occasionally punctuated with like really intense trauma and sadness and nostalgia. Right. It's unlike anything. I recently was talking to Marcus Lindblom, who was the main translator. He's going to write the foreword to the Earthbound book that I'm writing, and I asked him, I was like, you're in your 50s. You worked on this game in 95. Have you encountered anything like it? So with so many different influences, and it could be anything. I said books, movies, video games. And the only thing he could think of was, "Oh, brother, where art thou?"
It's that specific Coen Brothers movie.
Yeah. And I was like, that made a little sense to me because it's goofy and yet it's punctuated by, like I said, very real stakes and trauma and emotional situations. It's, it's very dominated by its music, its fascination with music and music sort of not necessarily varying styles, but certainly different presentations of one style. And, it's ambitious. It feels like a mythical story, but in a local place, but told really well and grandly. And even still, "Oh, brother, art thou?" not nearly as like idiosyncratic. So I feel like Earthbound does what like some grand novel that like, Cloud Atlas or something. That just is jumping from timeline to timeline, tone to tone. And I feel like it, it pulls it off beautifully as well as any piece of art can. So I'm writing the book not from the perspective of someone who loves this as a video game. I'm writing it as someone who loves it as a piece of art.
Now I feel like I've got to represent for the Genesis kids by writing about the Phantasy Star 2 through 4 that appeared on the Genesis. I remember playing those, and you're playing a role-playing game. It feels like you're making decisions. You're not really. There's one path, generally speaking. In that era, you could, I don't know if it was true of Earthbound literally, but you would end up at the same place if you played long enough, no matter what you did. I mean, in the same way, reading a book, you'll end up in the same place no matter what. Both of them pull you along. They take you with them, and it does seem to me the way you describe Earthbound and what it does well, that's kind of the advantage we've had writing books since, Ulysses, is pulling everything in and doing it in a way that you can be more concerned with the tasks of uniting disparate realms and then crafting a tone that can do that, right? I mean, that seems like part of your task with Solip here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's absolutely the case. It's sort of, you know, Blake Butler, who I do know Colony with, and we're just good friends. We've known each other for a long time. And, you know, I think that I know that the book that really changed his life and made him pursue literature was Infinite Jest. He was studying, I think, computer programming in college. He read Infinite Jest. He totally reorganized his entire life to pursue fiction, writing, reading. And I think he steals or cops this sort of like the idea. That's pretty common, but David Foster Wallace was a proponent of it. That, you know, pieces of fiction or pieces of art need to have some sort of logic. And you might not be able to talk about it explicitly. You may not be able to just immediately chart it out when you're done reading the book, but it's gotta have a sense of cohesion, that there is a tone, as you said, that allows you to do a bunch of wacky stuff or a bunch of disparate stuff, narratively or vocally. And I feel like Earthbound totally does have that tone. And that's exactly it. The tone is self-critical. It's super charming. It's goofy. It's silly. It doesn't take itself seriously at all. And yet it's very emotional and moral. And I feel like, yeah, you can in Earthbound, you can get away with, like, you know, becoming a disembodied spirit that then inhabits a robot as you chart to the final boss, or running around in like prehistory with dinosaurs attacking you, or running around in a neighborhood and beating up skateboarders with a baseball bat.
Yes.
Like, or being attacked by cops, all this like ridiculous stuff, but the tone permits. And so I feel like you're dead on. Solip, to me, it wasn't a top-down experience. You know, I didn't think like, okay, here's what I want to do, so let me construct a tone to do that. It totally came bottom up. It totally just presented itself. The voice did. And then when editing it, that's when the top-down sort of exercise came of, okay, what is this book going to do to a reader? How does it operate? And how can I emphasize its strengths? And how can I cut the stuff exactly that doesn't belong in that tone? And doesn't work, isn't permitted. And yeah, so I think that's an interesting way, certainly, to create fiction. I feel like probably most people, including Shigesato Itoi and my experience with Solip, we don't necessarily think like, let me construct the tone first. You can certainly have aims. You can certainly say like, I have this feeling, like I want to create something that has this feeling. But then for the most part, you just get to the actual work of it and then kind of like tweak and make sure if you're staying faithful to that feeling, you know, in the process.
Between Solip and the Earthbound book, you also have another book on the way, right? Did I have that chronology correct? What can we expect?
It's called Say-Cut Map, and it's coming out soon. I think it's done. I turned in another edit to the editors, and they're like, yeah, okay, this is it. We think we're gonna, you know, look at it one more time. But Say-Cut Map was composed again in a different way from anything I've written, in that sentence to sentence, I felt like I had a few things in my head that compelled me to write it. I was thinking about this couple, an unnamed couple, and their relationship. I was thinking about traveling to somewhere deeply foreign and disconcerting in its violence, and trying to help there. And, you know, if that reasoning was just or opportunistic. And then also trauma, physical trauma, and a very certain physical trauma involving, you know, the man in this sort of unnamed couple's his right hand. And so these images wouldn't leave my head, and I kept thinking about it. Finally, I just said, let me just sit down and write. I didn't know sort of what I wanted to do with it, or what tone it would have, or certainly what structure it would have. And then suddenly, sentence to sentence, I just felt myself like almost getting a a glimpse of a sentence from one episode in this couple's life, and then jumping, from the romance, from their early romance to his trauma in sort of a strange place, and then back, and then forward in their lives, and backwards, and et cetera, et cetera. And this sort of like crazy fragmented style just felt comfortable, and I felt like I'll just write it out and see where it goes. And so the book is primarily the story of a man and a woman who come to love each other, and what that love does to them in the face of physical trauma and media attention as well.
Which you know something about.
Yeah, I guess now. And again, it's certainly going to be a peculiar read for people who aren't too deeply into sort of weirder literature. But I don't think it's prohibitively weird. I want to make sure it isn't. And I want people to know that, to me, the book feels incredibly romantic and painful. And yeah, it is fragmented, but hopefully it's fragmented in a way that like Markson is, where it's beautiful and lucid, crazy, but lucid, you know what I mean? Crazy and lucid at the same time. And to me, like I said, I feel like it's a romance. I really do. I feel like it's just a painful and partly amputated romance. And those exist,
I've been speaking with Ken Baumann, author of the new novel or non-novel, whichever you prefer, Solip. He is also the co-publisher with Blake Butler of No Colony. He is the proprietor of Sator Press, and he's got 2 more books on the way. Ken, thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. I've been Colin Marshall. Find more from me at colinmarshall.org and more from the LARB at lareviewofbooks.org. Thanks.